Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to England. The village of Tenham, situated between the towns of Sittingbourne and Faversham, has long held a notable place in the history of Kent in England. Once part of the estates of the medieval Archbishops of Canterbury, it became distinguished in the reign of Henry VIII, when Richard Harris, the king's fruiterer, planted the first cherry trees in the fields, setting in motion one of the village's most enduring industries. The people of Tenham also grew hops, another crop that would come to define the Kentish landscape for generations. Hops in particular transformed the district, for their cultivation spread across Kent and made the county famous for supplying the local breweries. By the 19th century, there were a great number of cherry orchards, as well as hop poles that stretched across the parish. Alongside farming, brickmaking also provided employment, and the arrival of the London to Dover Railway in the 1850s enabled Tenham's hops, cherries and apples to reach the capital with greater speed. Though modest in size, with its cottages, farmsteads and the church of St Mary's at its heart, Tenham was industrious and well regarded, its economy tied closely to the land and the brewing trade. Dearton Street Farm was one such place that grew both cherries and hops. In 1887, the farmhouse was occupied by Mr. George Poysden and his family. Mr. Poysden was a bailiff to a local landowner named Mr. William Roper Dixon, a position that gave him steady employment and a place of some respect in the parish. Living with him at the farm were his wife and their 15-year-old daughter named Florence Cates, who had been born in 1872. Florence was a lively and affectionate girl who was greatly valued at home and well thought of in the village. Mr. George Poysden had taken on a lodger at Dearton Street Farm, a young man named Charles Walter. He had arrived there in 1884 when he was 21 years of age and worked as an agricultural labourer. At first, the young man presented himself as being respectable and industrious, and for a time he seemed to fit easily into the household. Yet as time passed, it became evident that his behaviour was less harmless than it had first appeared. By 1887, he had formed an unhealthy interest in Mr. and Mrs. Poysden's daughter, who had only just turned 15. She gave him no encouragement, and certainly did not return his affections. Her parents became increasingly uneasy about his intentions, and did everything they could to discourage him from entertaining any thoughts of familiarity with their daughter. Despite their vigilance, his feelings for Florence only seemed to grow, and what might once have been dismissed as a passing fancy deepened into a troubling fixation. On Wednesday, the 8th of June 1887, Charles Walter remained in bed as he was not feeling well and apparently suffering from an ailment which he had been complaining about for a few days. At 7 o'clock in the morning, he called out for Miss Florence Poysden and asked her to bring him medicine. At first she refused, unwilling to enter his room alone. Yet as his calls continued, she relented and reluctantly took up the medicine. As she stepped closer to the bed and handed him the medicine, he suddenly drew out a razor, which he had concealed beneath the bedclothes, and in spite of the young girl's struggles, he cut her throat, inflicting a deep and severe wound. Florence, who was now bleeding profusely, threw open the bedroom window, and seeing her mother in the yard below, she called out in a voice strained with fear and pain. Despite her injuries, she summoned the strength she had remaining to stagger from the room and make her way down the narrow staircase, each step leaving a trail of blood behind her. She met her mother at the bottom of the stairs, and as she went out into the yard, her father also rushed towards her, horrified by the sight before him. Seeing the terrible wound, Mr. Poysden clasped his daughter and cried out, "My poor child, you will die." He then hurried off in desperation to fetch the doctor. Mrs. Poysden stayed with Florence, but despite her best efforts and care, her daughter succumbed to her injuries and died in her arms about a quarter of an hour later. Charles Walter, having witnessed the outcome of his attack from his bedroom window, then turned the razor upon himself. The wound, however, proved superficial, failing to penetrate deeply enough to be fatal. Police Constable Gibson soon arrived at the farm, and his presence brought a measure of order to a chaotic scene. He moved quickly and decisively, taking immediate control of the situation. He restrained Charles Walter, who was weak and in shock from his self-inflicted wound, although it was now being treated by a doctor. Once the young man had been stabilised and was able to move without danger to himself, Constable Gibson escorted him from the farm and took him to Faversham Police Station, where he was put into custody. The following day, Thursday the 9th of June, Mr. Harris, the coroner, held an inquest into the tragic death of Florence Kate Poysden. The proceedings revealed the horrifying circumstances of her demise. It was stated that the young girl had died from a terrible gash across her throat, so deep that it had severed her windpipe. The prisoner was brought to court in a cab, and the streets from the police station were lined with people eager to see him. He was quite short and slightly built, with a fresh complexion, light hair, a neatly trimmed moustache, and rather hollow cheeks. He was dressed well, in a dark tweed suit. However, when he saw the mother of his victim, he broke down in tears, and it took a few minutes for him to regain his composure. The coroner instructed that the jury should be taken to inspect the bedroom where the attack had occurred. The scene was ghastly. The bed, walls and floor were covered with blood, a reminder of the violence that had taken place. When the jury returned, Mr. Poysden gave evidence. He told the inquest what had happened the previous day and said that at the request of Charles Walter, who was ill and confined to bed, Florence had carried his medicine upstairs. He then told of how a few minutes later she had looked out of the window and screamed for her mother, calling desperately for assistance. Mr. Poysden then looked at the judge and said that shortly after this, he realised that his daughter's throat had been cut. Mrs. Poysden was the next to take the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the terrifying events. She told the inquest that upon hearing her daughter's desperate cries, she ran from the yard into the house, where she met Florence at the bottom of the stairs. She said that her daughter was covered in blood and struggling to breathe and clearly clinging to life. Mrs. Poysden then looked down before she said that Florence had managed to tell her that she had given Mr. Walter his medicine when he suddenly got out of bed with a razor and slashed her throat. By now tears were streaming down Mrs. Poysden's face as she described how she had lifted Florence and carried her as far as the granary, desperately seeking help. She said that there she saw her husband, who after embracing Florence, went to get a doctor. Mrs. Poysden then added that despite her frantic efforts and prayers, Florence's life slowly slipped away and she died in her arms. Her testimony grew even more harrowing as she recounted what followed. She said that Charles Walter came downstairs still in his pyjamas, with a wound across his throat, from which there was some blood. She said that he approached her with a strange calmness, extending his hand and asking for forgiveness. Mrs. Poysden was now overcome with grief and shock, and said that she could remember his words, which were spoken in a voice that was both chilling and detached. She told the court that he said, "Oh, Mrs. Poysden, forgive me and shake hands. You have always been so good to me. I can't think what I did it for." She said that before she could say anything, he went back upstairs and returned a few minutes later fully dressed. She said that once again he repeated his plea for forgiveness and declared that he would be hanged for his crime. Before stepping down, Mrs. Poysden added that the day before the murder, Florence and Mr. Walter had exchanged words, as Florence had told him that she did not want him dallying after her. Words that Mrs. Poysden said had appeared to have angered him. Another witness at the inquest recalled that Charles Walter had taken his razor to be sharpened only the day before the murder, a detail that in retrospect cast a far more sinister meaning on what might otherwise have been seen as an ordinary act. Mrs. Anne-Marie Houghton told the inquest that she had arrived at the house just as the girl was dying. She said that Mr. Walter had been pacing his room, so she went up and asked him why he had done it, to which he replied, "She had been teasing me and saying she should go out in the afternoon." Dr. Manning was the next witness and stated that he reached the house as soon as possible after being summoned, but when he arrived, Florence had already died. He confirmed that death had been caused by a cut to her throat, inflicted by a razor, and said that when he realised that Florence was dead, he attended to Mr. Walter's wounds. He said that he spoke to Mr. Walter, who told him that when Florence came to his room, the desire suddenly seized him to kill her. Other witnesses spoke of Mr. Walter's conduct during his stay at Dearton Street Farm. They testified that he had long displayed a marked fondness for young Florence, which often gave way to jealousy, particularly when she showed him indifference or spent time in the company of others. Police Constable Gibson was the last witness. He testified that he arrested Mr. Walter, who in reply to the charge said, "Yes, and I don't know what I did it for." During the inquest, Mr. Walter declined to cross-examine any of the witnesses, and when asked by the magistrate if he had anything to say, he replied, "I can't remember doing it, sir, and that is the truth." Then, pointing to Police Constable Gibson, he said, "I only remember this man coming upstairs." From the testimony of witnesses, it seemed that what had begun as misplaced affection had turned into a dangerous obsession of intensity of feeling that ultimately ended in violence. The jury listened to all the testimony, and after reviewing the medical evidence, alongside the statements of Mr. and Mrs. Poysden and others, they returned their verdicts. They found that the deceased, Miss Florence Kate Poysden, had died as a direct result of the wounds deliberately inflicted upon her by Charles Walter, and on that basis, it was declared that Mr. Walter must stand charged with the crime of wilful murder, and that he would be committed for trial. The funeral of Miss Florence Poysden took place on the Saturday afternoon, drawing a crowd of around 200 people, most of them villagers who had known the Poysden family well. The service was solemn and deeply moving, conducted by Reverend Corbould, who was the vicar of Tenham. Among the mourners were Florence's friends from the Tenham Church Sunday School, who followed the coffin in a slow, mournful procession. Florence had been a devoted pupil there, a regular presence each week, and her gentle nature had made her a favourite with both teachers and classmates alike. Her coffin was adorned with 20 wreaths, each a quiet expression of affection and grief. They came from the vicar and his family, from Mr. F. Honeyball, from the children of the parish, from the schoolmaster Mr. Winterton, and from the superintendent and teachers of the Sunday school. Many others too had sent floral tributes, a simple gesture of love and sorrow, for a girl whose kindness had touched so many in the village. Meanwhile, from Faversham Police Station, Charles Walter was taken under guard to Maidstone Prison, where he would await his trial. His transfer drew a large and restless gathering outside, as people came to catch a glimpse of the man whose actions had shattered their community. Murmurs of disbelief and horror rippled through the crowd, due to the savage nature of the crime, the youth and innocence of the victim, and the dreadful betrayal within a household that had once treated Mr. Walter almost as one of their own. All this combined to leave the district in a state of deep sorrow and outrage. On Saturday the 9th of July 1887, Charles Walter was brought before the court to face the charge of wilful murder. From the outset, however, a question arose that would overshadow the proceedings: the prisoner's mental states. There was uncertainty as to whether he was fit to stand trial, and the court moved cautiously to resolve this critical matter. To address the concern, evidence was presented from Dr. Francis Davies, the superintendent of the Barming Heath Asylum. Dr. Davies testified that he had examined the defendant, Mr. Charles Walter, the previous week, and said that in his opinion he was not in a fit state to comprehend the charge laid against him. The doctor noted that Mr. Walter's understanding of his surroundings and the court proceedings that were going to take place was hazy at best, revealing a mind struggling to grasp even the most basic elements of his situation. Dr. Davies also drew attention to a troubling family history. An uncle of Mr. Walter's, at the same time, was confined to the Barming Asylum, pointing to the possibility of a hereditary predisposition to a mental disorder. Based on his professional assessment, the doctor concluded with certainty that the defendant, Mr. Charles Walter, was affected by such a disorder and as a result was incapable of entering a plea or participating meaningfully in his trial. Following this assessment, the judge instructed the jury to find the defendant, Mr. Charles Walter, not fit to plead. As a result, the case did not proceed to the ordinary trial of murder, Instead, the judge ordered that the defendant be committed to an asylum during Her Majesty's pleasure, a legal phrase denoting indefinite confinement under the authority of the Crown, with no set date for release. In this way, the trial that had been anticipated by the community came to an abrupt and unusual conclusion. There was no public verdict of guilt in the ordinary sense, no judicial reckoning in a crowded courtroom. Yet the people of Tenham and the surrounding villages remained haunted by the tragic memory of Florence Kate Poysden, whose life had been so violently and unjustly taken in her own home. They carried with them the name of Charles Walter, the lodger they had once welcomed into their community, whose actions continued to cast a terrible shadow over the village. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case